Question: how do we identify a worldwide flood versus where evidence like fossilized trees are interpreted as a local flood theory?
All right. Well, if I just throw a thing in and then I'll hand it over to John because I've actually got some slides up and ready that I could use. If you remember where we started with after Diane, we started at Jurassic Ark. Here's the Jurassic Ark rocks, right? And John mentioned quite a few pieces of evidence. Their trees being sort of abraded at the ends. You find orientation, so they're all pointing in the same way. The trees are broken, abraded at the end. It's a mixed dump. There are huge rocks and boulders buried with it. So there's no doubt about it. We're dealing with a flood fossil log jam, right? It's definitely a log jam, definitely from a flood, and it produced most of this sediment. And you've got to ask the question, as Jim P did, how do we know that this is a worldwide flood and not a local one? Well, first of all, it's called Jurassic Ark because these are the Jurassic rocks. The Jurassic rocks were named by Alexander von Humboldt because he traveled the world and recognized the rocks all over the world, different types of rocks all over the world, as all being the same as the ones in the Jura Mountains. So just by its name definition, right, the Jurassic rocks, these are the rocks like the ones in the Jura Mountains, and they are indeed a worldwide deposit. But if we just focus in on the one specific log jam here, right, how big is this flood dump? How big is this log jam? Well, there's your Jurassic flood log bed in Australia. You can see it runs there. Gympie is sort of over in this kind of area around here, sort of north of Brisbane, right? And you can see that the Jurassic flood log bed goes all the way over Queensland, down into New South Wales, all the way over, touches the Northern Territory, and all the way up north in Queensland as well. Now, I've actually driven through a very small amount of Australia, and it's a pretty big country. But for those of you who aren't quite used to the size, let's put Australia compared to the United Kingdom, right? You can fit the United Kingdom in Queensland 6 times over. It's actually pretty much exactly the same size as the United States, so it's not a small country by any means, but there's your log jam. Again, that's about 6 times the size of the United Kingdom. So this is not a small flood log deposit at all. And if you're going to have enough water to be able to produce a deposit of that size, you are not only going to cover the entire of Australia with water, you're going to cover the entire of the entire of the world, including the United Kingdom on the other side of the world, with water as well. So as soon as you're dealing with something on this size, a deposit which is intercontinental, you are going to be dealing with a global flood deposit. It's the same for the Chattanooga Shale in the USA. It's the same for the Jurassic Lias in the UK. You can trace them all over the world. These are enormous deposits for sure, and they are worldwide deposits. So, John?
Okay, I'll take the other extreme and look at the local floods. Local floods are easy to study and easy to recognize, or local catastrophes. Mount St. Helens, a case in point. I was there shortly after the thing blew up. It was great to be there because there were no restrictions, no fences. I could go wherever I liked and do the research. That was great. But what you'll find is when you walked up the Tuttle River, where many of the trees that had been smashed had been washed down, you found trees unpetrified, sitting there with their broken roots, etc., sitting there with volcanic sediment. But while they stayed exposed, none of them were anything other than a flood deposit, but a local river catastrophic volcanic deposit. And that's what most of them have stayed. However, in some of the bigger eruptions, yes, I say bigger because some of the previous eruptions have produced massive layers of ash compared to the present. And in them, I have personally found petrified logs. But the characteristic is like in, where we have fossil people over there in the cities that were covered in ash in Italy and Greece in volcanic eruptions a couple of thousand years ago, you will find to be turned into a fossil, it has to be buried really quickly. And so there are trees, vertical ones, turned to stone in the volcanic deposits, only a couple of thousand years old at the most at Mount St. Helens. And yet that is a limited deposit, bigger than the present, but a limited deposit. When you go to the Missoula River, you can actually follow a lot of the rocks downriver and there's a place where you can see where it basically ran out of oomph, right? And the deposit stops. When you go over to the eastern side and you follow the massive ice floods that have come down from melting rocks in Canada, this is post-flood. The ice is mentioned in the book of Job. It's post-Babel, and yet even it has produced semi-petrified rocks, but also on a limited deposit. As Joe said, Australia is a big place. Now, on that map, we only showed you the one bed where you can actually connect all the dots and follow it round. But if you would come to me, I could show you the Jurassic rocks down on the south coast, and they're full of fossil trees. I could take you to the Jurassic rocks in New Zealand because I've been to all of these places. Yes, I've worn out a lot of shoe leather. And yes, if you want to make donations to the ministry to help us pay for my shoe leather and all these other things, we are truly grateful to all of you who are sending in donations now and through the website. But you will see these are characteristics of a much bigger flood. So there's your criteria. As I tell people at Jurassic Ark, okay, this is provably a flood deposit. Look at the abraded trees, look at the points, but how big was the flood? And that's where they have to think. And that's where you decide, will I believe there's a possibility of a worldwide flood? If there was, what would the evidence be? Good old Buddy Song. So you'll find that very, very helpful to begin to ponder on the size of this catastrophe. Joe, back to you.
Joe, I'd like to end with just reading Psalms 29.
Yep, go right ahead.
The Lord, the God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. It says it's majestic. And it says the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon, makes Lebanon skip like a calf, like taking the country and skipping a rock across the water. He is all powerful. And it describes this global flood where he's over the waters, breaking these trees up and dumping them right there in Australia.
Yeah, and I love the way that finishes at verse 10, where it says, the Lord sits as king over the flood. And what's
Yes.
interesting about that psalm is that the word for flood there is the only place outside of Genesis where it's used, because it's a Hebrew word, mabul, and that's the word to describe Noah's flood. Any other flood required a different Hebrew word. So you can always tell if Noah's flood's being talked about. So spot on, Glenn. Great stuff. Great way to finish. Joe?